Wonderful. So good afternoon, everyone, or good morning. Happy Friday. It's finally Friday. It's the middle of the semester. We are super grateful to you for showing up and look forward to wonderful conversation with Dr. Archana Pathak today. Many of you know me. My name is Christina Stanchin. I'm the director of the Humanities Research Center here at VCU. And I'm glad you're here for our third event in the series, HRC Research Fridays, which is a new thing we started this year, a series of events dedicated to supporting our ongoing research, mentoring, grant writing, and other research and scholarly projects, both for faculty and for graduate students. We held two very well-attended events in September. We had a grant writing workshop for humanities scholars and a research presentation with the 2019-2020 residential fellows. And they are or will be posted on our website very soon if you missed them. The last event of the semester in this series will be in 2 weeks on October the 22nd, and it will feature Ebony Walden and Dr. Megan Goff in the Wilder School, who will discuss their recent community project called Richmond Racial Equity Essays. And we hope you can join us. So today, I'm delighted to welcome Dr. Archana Pathak, who will share with us ideas about how underrepresented faculty in the humanities and the social sciences can build mentoring networks that can both support and sustain them. And I was chatting with Archana right before the event. I was in a meeting before this workshop today with a colleague in the School of Dentistry who suggested that this term needs a revision, right? Underrepresented minority faculty. He actually offered the term systematically excluded faculty, which I really think is very appropriate. And as it happens, for those of you, oops, my phone here, for those of you who have been enrolled in the Faculty Success Program or are now in the alumni program with NCFDD, we are studying mentoring networks in the coming weeks. So I think this is a perfect time in the semester to talk about this. So I will introduce Dr. Pathak briefly, and after her presentation, we will have time for Q&A. I'd like you to post them in the Q&A function during the presentation, and we won't be recording the conversation session. So we want everyone to bring their questions. Dr. Archana Pathak is a diasporic feminist scholar activist many of us know and love at VCU. And her work examines issues of race, class, gender, sexuality, nationality, and scientific imperialism from a social justice perspective. Academically trained in intercultural communication and qualitative research methodologies, she uses autoethnography to explore how we tell ourselves and each other who we are. She is the former president and board member of the Conciliation Project, a not-for-profit social justice theater organization that addresses issues of racism and oppression. While serving in an official capacity with the Conciliation Project, she co-authored a staged reading titled A Canary's Call, Dismantling the Master's House, which is a satirical look at the experiences of women of color in academia. Her TED Talk, entitled Embracing My Superpower, Living in the In-Between, is based on her scholarly work on immigration and race. Many of us know her work, advocacy, and service to the university in her role as the Special Assistant for Projects and Director of the Q Collective in the Office of Institutional Equity, Effectiveness, and Success. It is my pleasure to welcome Dr. Pathak to HRC today, and I'm so grateful to you for your time and expertise.
Thank you so much, Christina. I am so excited to be here, and I'm really looking forward more to a conversation than a presentation necessarily. And I'm looking at all of the lovely individuals who have joined us in the webinar. I'm looking at the list of participants, and I'm thinking, well, Hopefully I have something to say that is that you don't already know, but I see some great folks already in the room who I think are themselves brilliant mentors and probably have a lot to offer to the conversation. So I'm pretty excited. I do have some slides to share, so I will go ahead and share my screen and we'll move forward. Does that sound like a plan? All right. To go to that. And of course, it's not set to where I need it to be. It should be here. And we'll put it on present. All right. Okay, so I'm gonna get started. I'd like to spend a little bit of time talking about a few concepts and some of the ideas. If I reference some research in my presentation, I'm happy to share those resources after the fact. Christine, I'll send you an email with some PDFs that that you can share with whoever, or you can also put on the HRC website, however you want to do that, right? So as I said, I really do want us to have a conversation more than anything else. However, what I will do is start by telling some stories. To me, as an autoethnographer, utilizing the self as subject and object for analysis is really an interesting way to think about how the embodied experiences can become empirical evidence for, and does serve as empirical evidence for understanding how systemic oppression works through and with us and on us as we function in such a large institution that really wasn't made to be home for any of us, especially when we identify as multiply marginalized individuals. So I'm gonna really come at this from a place of storytelling and share some of my own experiences, both as someone who has been very fortunately been wonderfully mentored, and also in the ways in which I have worked as a mentor for others and what it means to have that kind of symbiotic relationship. So first I want to talk about who I am. Christina obviously told you a little bit about my professional identity, right? So I'm faculty in gender, sexuality, and women's studies. I'm also interim director of the Q Collective, BCU's Queer Research and Advocacy Center, and I serve as special assistant for programs and initiatives in IES. So one of the things that I bring to the table is this idea of moving from faculty to administration and what that experience is like and how that shapes my relationship to the academy. But I also think it's important to understand the social identities I hold and the ways in which they shape my experiences. I identify as South Asian, I identify as queer and femme. I'm a 1.5er, I'm Hindu, I'm a term faculty member, and I also identify as middle class or bourgeoisie. And I can talk about those aspects of my identity at any given point. So I want to start by talking about the fact that what I realized very early in my career, for a variety of reasons, that mentoring was something I was going to have to do for myself as much as I was going to have to find others to do it with and for me. Part of that was that I came into the academy, and while I did have middle class privilege and caste privilege, in which my family had access to higher education and was able to guide me in higher education, they had absolutely no idea how to guide me in higher education that was in the social sciences or in the humanistic social sciences or humanities. They didn't know what to do with me, or they didn't have anybody they could connect me with. So the mentoring networks that I could have tapped into already just immediately kind of dissipated because everyone they knew who could mentor me was in the natural sciences or in a STEM field. And so in learning that about myself and trying to find a way to talk about my own work in spaces where I really was absent. So I went into intercultural communication. Most intercultural communication research at the time had two components to it. There were those in sociology, psychology, and ethnic studies programs that looked at sort of like Black-white US communication questions. And then there was this whole world of intercultural communication that was actually international communication, and it was overdetermined by Japanese-US relations. And so I was sort of like, I want to study Indian people. And they were like, we don't know what to do with that population. How big is it really? At a time when it was one of the fastest growing Asian diasporic communities in the United States. And so I didn't really have anyone who knew what I wanted to do. I thought this was the right field, but there was a lot of confusion. So there's a couple of things that I've learned in my journey. One is that critical self-reflexivity is central to effectively doing this work. It is hard, but it is necessary. And so autoethnography sort of came to me partly because what I realized that I had to be the one who was willing to take that very hard and very distanced look at myself. I didn't have a lot of people who understood my lived experience well enough for them to say to me, well, this is what's happening, and this is where you're making some mistakes, and this is where you're doing a good job. I just had to do that on my own. And so I began to take the skills I was taught about observing human behavior and applying it to myself. So I started doing autoethnographic work well before I even knew there was a method that I could use or a way to write about that. And so that critical self-reflexivity is important. And I encourage anyone that I mentor to take the time to really ask the hard questions of yourself about who you are, what works for you, what doesn't work for you, and be willing to be honest and vulnerable with yourself around that. Another thing that I learned along the journey, which was probably my hardest lesson in a lot of ways, and I still struggle with it, to be very, very honest, and that is that self-care is not the same as self-indulgence. Self-care is sometimes very hard, and it requires an immense amount of discipline. So, we want to think of self-care like there's an entire, what I will call a sort of a kind of a white feminist kind of industry around self-care, about like bubble baths and chocolate and wine, and all those things are fun, right? And I think they're important and absolutely necessary. But self-care as a woman of color in the academy often means saying no to social events so that I can get the rest I need, having very clear boundaries between my professional relationships and my personal relationships. Sometimes it means that I get up and make lunch, even though I really want to lay in bed and eat bonbons. I don't know who does that, but people say they do. So, I just like, this was, and I still struggle with this because I think I'm going to do some self-care. And then 3 hours later, I've binged Netflix, eaten pizza, and I'm anxious. I'm more anxious at the end of those 3 hours than I was before. Right now, it's not because I binge Netflix and ate pizza. It's because I framed that as though I was doing self-care, and I'm lying to myself, because the self-care that I might have needed might have been getting some things organized around the house so that my external space is calming and not eating away at me while I am trying to get the rest I need. Right. And so and I still struggle with that. I'll be very honest. I'm, again, happy to move into conversation and talk about it. Another lesson that I learned early on is that the conversations around mentoring and when I was being mentored by people was very personal. They were telling me really, really intimate things about myself, and it was hard to hear. And I had to learn to not take it personally. So the thing that is tricky here is that when I ask someone to mentor me, I invite them in for critique. And so by inviting them in for critique, I'm asking them to make assessments and judgments of my personal self. And so then it's up to me to find a way to take care of my own feelings around that and be able to hear the kinds of things that are being said. Now, I will say, I want to be really clear. There's a clear caveat here. I have had people who did not treat me well, and that was different. And I am not necessarily talking about that. There were definitely people who positioned themselves as mentors to me who were actually utilizing that as an abuse of authority, right? Or who were utilizing that to tear me down. And I had to be the one who had to step back and say, I can't do this relationship, right? But there were also mentors who care for me deeply, who wanted to see me succeed and had to tell me hard things about me that I didn't like hearing, right? And so I do want to make that distinction. I'm not talking about the person who bullies you as much as I am talking about that it's not always easy to hear this. And last, I realized that my longevity in higher education and my longevity as a scholar and definitely as an administrator, is that my joy has to drive my choices regarding work. And here the caveat is that we don't actually know what joy is. We've confused this. So we often, this kind of neoliberal system, kind of driven through corporate capitalism, tells us that immediate gratification is joy, and it's not. Sometimes the work that brings me the greatest joy is the most frustrating. It makes me stay up at night. I was last night working really, really late and doing and sending emails, and I was very frustrated. I really wanted to go. I wanted to turn off. I didn't necessarily even want to go to bed. I just wanted to turn off, and I couldn't. So I wasn't necessarily happy. But do you know what? I got a bunch of things sent out, and I know that the programs that I was working on last night are meaningful and important. And immediately got an email this morning from somebody who was like, this is so exciting. I can't wait to do this. It's like, okay, there's the joy. That's the joy. No, it was not fun, right? But it was definitely, there was joy there. It was knowing what that work was, where that work was taking me. I think it's also important for us to dismantle some myths. So I want to talk about mentoring in the world of mentoring beyond survival. I think that the model of survival as the standard is incredibly problematic and very dangerous. This screen is not this. I know you can't read it all. So sorry about that. I had some tech problems. So I want to dismantle a couple myths. First, overwork is not a direct indicator of success. And I want to share a story about this. Early on, when I was in graduate school, I feel like I was finishing my PhD or had just finished my PhD very, very early in my career. I had a Latinx senior person who was maybe a few years ahead of me give me some advice. And in one way, that advice was brilliant. In another way, it damaged me for a long time. So it was really interesting. And so I want to be clear, it was the way I took that advice and ran with it, that was the issue, not necessarily the advice itself. So this person said to me, it's really, really important that you have a narrative of being busy. And I said, what do you mean? And she said, they have to know that you're busy. They don't get that we are busy, that we work hard, that we do a lot of work, right? And so I was like, okay. But what I did was I collapsed that. And then I thought being busy was going to be the thing that would indicate my success. And what I found was overworking actually made me less successful, because it didn't let me do the critical self-reflexivity. It didn't let me center joy. It did not let me have the space and the time to do my best work, right? So overwork is not a direct indicator of success, right? That doesn't mean I don't work hard, and it doesn't mean that it's not important, but I also understand that doing the work to a certain point is successful. And then after that, it just has a point of diminishing returns, right? So I think it's very, very important to recognize that. I also think the war metaphors that we use and that are so popular in the workplace are ultimately do us more harm. So people talk about coming to work, battle ready. I'm going to pull out my sword. Here we go. I've used them. I've used them throughout my career. Ultimately, I got to a point where I realized that had me functioning at this high threat level model that was absolutely siphoning my energy source. So then everything I did was not as strong or as thoughtful as it could be, because my energy was being siphoned all day into this sort of attack ready mode, right? Now, I also understand that we are often under attack. So what does that mean, and how do we handle that? And that's something I want to get into in the conversation, because I think that there are ways that we can do this that doesn't siphon our energy, that we can be thoughtful and responsive and protect ourselves from the attacks that come without like activating our amygdala through that whole process, right? And so what does that then mean? Another myth I'd like to dismantle is the idea of what is work. Work is work. It's nothing more than that, but it's also nothing less than that. It is an integral part of our identity. It matters. We do it. Don't lie to ourselves that we don't want it to matter, but don't also make it your whole identity, right? So I think that it's about the balance of that. So I love my job. I am willing to admit that. Does it treat me well? No. But I do love the work I do. I do it for a reason. nobody forces me to come into work every day. It's not just because I have to pay bills, because if it was just that I had to pay bills, I would be doing all kinds of other things and making more money. So it's not that, obviously, right? So I have to own what it is, but I also have to let it go and not let it be defined, not let it define me. I think it's also important, and this I think comes from the neoliberal academy, this idea that it's not what is the outcome? So if the outcome is good, then we did the right job. Like, what's good and right is when there's an outcome. It isn't our job to fix it all. We can't. There is no way that we're going to fix it all, but it is our job to keep working on it. So, I often use the phrase, my goal is always to leave it better than I found it, whatever that might be. Right. And so, but I think that we're often pushed for the big return, for the big payoff, the big bang. And that's just not fair. And so I think it's important that we set realistic standards for ourselves and for each other. What is realistic? What is better than we found it? What is a movement forward? Give ourselves value for that, and then keep pushing ourselves to the next level. Oops. All right. So when we think about mentoring then, and how to build, how to get mentored, I'm sure we all already know that the traditional mentoring model of a mentor, an individual who is sort of the guru who takes you to the end, is no longer effective or efficient. I don't know that it ever really was. Though I will say that what the guru model can do is there may be somebody who lives in your mentoring matrix throughout your career and your lifetime. So there's somebody who travels with you on the journey, but their role within the matrix might shift and change and grow. And I'll talk a little bit about my own mentors and how that works. So one of the things, there's several different very interesting mentoring new models in terms of mentoring. There's a mutual mentoring model that looks at sort of how we can think about mentoring as a mutually beneficial relationship. There's also a really powerful model called La Colectiva, which I'll share the essay with you. And it talks about how we build a mentoring network that performs multiple different functions. But when we talk about systemically excluded faculty, it's important that we understand that mentoring has to both address the issues, the pragmatic issues of assessment, the things that we are judged on for success. So our writing, our teaching, right? And I didn't put service in there, and I'll tell you why. We don't necessarily need service mentors. What we do need are mentors who help us understand the relationship of service to our writing and our teaching. And so, so one of the things I was taught early on, nothing gets done if it doesn't fit in more than at least two of the categories, right? So if I do service, where else does it fit? Is it also part of my writing? Is it also part of my teaching? And then how to build the narrative about that relationship so that we have to tell them how to assess us. We cannot rely on the system of tenure and promotion to do an effective assessment of the ways in which we frame our work, right? And so it's very, very important that we give them the assessment tool and then tell them how to apply it to the work we've done, okay? We also need to find mentors who do work-life family balance. I think that the work-life narrative that is utilized tends to overdetermine Eurocentric nuclear family models. And most of us don't come from Eurocentric or nuclear family models. And so for me, I have work, I have a life, and I have family. And those three things have to get balanced out in a particular kind of way. So it becomes very, very important to address that. Another thing that you want to think about in terms of mentoring is finding individuals who can help you build community beyond vocation. What often happens is so much of the work we do is in our communities that the lines are so blurred, we can't really tell who we are, where we start and stop in relationship to the communities that we live in, are from, and then also serve. So it becomes important to start saying, okay, where am I outside of that, right? Where are those lines? you also should work on building what I call a circle of trust. A circle of trust are those people who may or may not mentor you, but they're the ones who have the most access to the most intimate information about you and are intimately involved in your life. Now, if I'm saying that there's a circle of trust, that means that all these other people, all these other areas that I've listed, those people may not actually fit there. And so I'm about to give you I'm going to talk a little bit about selecting mentors and what that looks like in a second, right? And you also want to think about culturally situated. And when I say culturally situated, I mean that in terms of social identity, but I also mean that in terms of institution, discipline, methodology, right? So where is what is your cultural home, and how is the person who you are asking to work with you as a mentor, how are they culturally situated in that conversation? They don't have to be culturally situated in this is the same as you, but identifying the cultural location of each party helps a lot in this process. So here are some considerations in no particular order, right? And these are sayings and statements that people have said to me over time that I have been able to flesh out and tease out. So I think they become important, and I want to share them with you. Allies aren't always friends, and friends aren't always allies. I think this is really, really important. Because the mentoring relationship is an interpersonal one, we expect it oftentimes falsely to function like friendship, and it's not. Your mentors aren't always your friends or your allies, and friends and allies aren't necessarily mentors. Can it happen? Sure. Does it happen? Absolutely. And I am very fortunate to have mentors who I would also consider friends, right? But that takes time. It takes time both in terms of depth of relationship, but just also longevity, right? And it isn't always my goal. There are people I am mentored by to whom I am incredibly grateful, with whom I don't have a friendship, they're not my friends. We wouldn't socialize outside of the mentoring space. I don't know, I may know a lot about their life because they've shared it with me as text for analysis, not because we're intimately close, right? I never forget that there is a power differential between us in a particular kind of way. It's not a bad thing. It's just a thing that's true, right? And they also may not be my allies. They may be very clear that these individuals have their own agenda within the institution. It doesn't necessarily align with my agenda in the institution. That's okay. But they are teaching me something, and that becomes important as well. And that means that mentoring relationships aren't always fixed or permanent. People can be your mentors at certain points, for certain moments, even for certain situations, right? So you can join a committee and you might connect with someone on that committee, and that person mentors you through that committee process, right? And they teach you a whole bunch of things. It's great. It's wonderful. I'll give you an example. When I was at a different institution, I was asked to be on a task force charged by the president of the university to address the crisis in diversity. The individual who was the chair of that committee quickly became my mentor. She mentored me for the 2-year-long process that task force was in place. It was incredible. She left the institution. I've never heard from her again. But everything she taught me in those 2 years was incredibly powerful, incredibly important, incredibly necessary. I could find her. I know enough detail about who she is, whatever, but it's like it worked, it was fine, and then we moved on, right? It's also important that you take what you need and leave the rest. And this really ties to the idea of culturally situated, right? So I'll go back to that same person. That person was an older African-American woman who clearly identified as Christian. And we had lots of really powerful conversations about doing diversity work in higher education that were great. And a lot of it was framed through a socio-religious or socio-cultural lens that came from her own understanding of spirituality that really didn't speak to me at all, right? But instead of feeling isolated from her, what I was able to do is say, okay, I see, I'll take the overarching argument. For you, spirituality functions in a particular way that helps you think about this work. Great. I'll work on that by myself later in a culturally situated situation and see if I can't find people who align with my understanding of the cosmos, but I can't take that from you. What you're giving me just doesn't matter. Everything else she told me about navigating higher education, addressing issues of power, having how to just even build a committee to effectively move forward policy that is controversial, right? Like all those things, super important, super useful, super great. Really appreciated it. And so I'm actually going to skip the admission one for a second and say, so context matters, but it isn't a deal breaker, right? So I mean, the context mattered. Sure, there were some conversations that I felt somewhat uncomfortable with her because I was like, okay, like I've told you a few times that I don't believe what you believe, but okay, whatever, that's fine. But it wasn't a deal breaker because I was learning a lot. It was useful. I was able to find other ways to take care of myself around the other things. There's always a price of admission. And I think this is super important. Everything, and I liken this to going to the movies. So a movie comes out, you look at it, you think, I really want to see that movie. It is worth it. I am going opening night, so I'm going to pay that full price ticket. I'm going to brave the crowds. I will get, all the time it will take to get there early, to make sure I have my popcorn, find a good seat. I'll do it all because this movie is worth it, right? And then there are other movies that come out and you're like, maybe a matinee, right? I just want to pay matinee prices. I don't really want to deal with crowds. I'll wait a couple of weeks, let it be in the theaters and let the crowds die down before I go. And then there's some movies that come out where like, it'll come to Netflix, it'll be fine, right? And we don't need to go, right? And so that's also true around mentoring. There is a price of admission. Mentors are there for their own benefit as well. I often use the phrase that Mahatma Gandhi used. Somebody asked him, what led him to do work in the poor villages, in the poor lower caste villages, and how did he get to this place of being so able to serve others, right? And he said, oh, please don't get it confused. I do this for my ego. This makes me know that I am a good person, right? And I think that hit me very hard. One, as an ethnographer and as an auto-ethnographer, right? Like we are not the beneficent, giver of things, right? But it also made me understand, yeah, there's always, people benefit from doing these things. When I mentor people, I benefit from that. Absolutely. It introduces me to cutting edge research. It connects me to communities that are important to me. It helps me build my own networks at the institution. And if I were to pretend that that wasn't true, I'd be lying to myself and to those who I'm mentoring. So that's always there. And that's where I think that we can begin to understand mentoring as as a mutual process. So I'm also being, I'm going to say I'm also being mentored, right? The further and further I get away from my doctoral experience, right? The more and more I need to find connections to those who have the proximity to that experience. And so mentoring allows that for me. And that's important to recognize and acknowledge. So I'm going to stop here actually, Christina, because I really want to open it up for conversation. And I want to I want to see what kinds of stories others have and address questions. I can't see if there's any questions yet, so.
There are no questions yet. And, just to give folks a little bit of time to process and, come up with questions, because we are closing the recording very soon. And because I know I've heard from many of you who could not be here, but are looking forward to watching this video once we post it on the website. I just wanted to, to say thank you for your contribution, for your interest in this, and also to remind you that we have a wonderful speaker series in November, continuing through November, and I wanted to highlight two important events in that series. Our next one of the events I would like everyone to attend is Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz's talk on her recent book, which I think we scheduled for the beginning of November. Of course, thank you for supporting the HRC and for showing up to these events, which give us a reason to continue. And on this note, I would like to stop the recording so we can have a conversation.